and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Steven Dimmitt is a rock climber, podcaster, and entrepreneur. He left his engineering job to move into a van full-time and pursue his dream of becoming a professional rock climber. For the past year, he has been making the Nugget Climbing Podcast. He interviews world-class climbers to tease out the habits and routines that got them where they are today. The podcast has been a great success, hitting over 400,000 downloads in the first 16 months. Steven's goal is to learn from the best in the world. He hopes to apply the nuggets he learns from his guests to improve his own climbing and to help share their inspiring stories. He loves empowering his listeners to take the leap that they've been dreaming of. Steven Dimmitt, it's a pleasure to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Thanks so much, Casey. It's really good to be here. I really appreciate it.
It's an absolute honor to invite you and host you. This is an absolutely fair question. So this is no knock on me for not knowing this, but where in the world are you right now?
That is a very fair question. I do live in a van full time and I bounce around the country all the time. So I'm actually in Wenatchee, Washington right now, where I grew up, and I'm spending some time with family, taking a short break from living on the road, actually sleeping in a bed at my parents' house, which is a nice change of pace.
Nice.
And I'm in a training cycle right now. So I actually have my own climbing coach right now, and he's guiding me through a six week training program that I'm primarily doing at the gym here in town. Because it's so hot, I haven't been climbing on rocks too much in the last few weeks. I've just been training inside. So trying to get a little stronger, and then I'll be headed back out on the road in a couple weeks.
Man, that's great. That was actually one of the questions I was going to ask you is like, what is cross training like for a climber?
Yeah, it can look like a lot of different things. It's the specificity, practice like you play thing first and foremost. So most of my training for climbing is on artificial indoor climbing walls, and it's basically just trying to practice the brute strength element of what you would find outdoor climbing. So I'm climbing most of the time on an overhanging wooden board with lots of little holds all over it, making up routes or trying other people's routes. I have whole workouts, built around how many of each difficulty grade to try to do in a session. So actually climbing and doing, targeted climbing workouts is the bulk of it. But I've also done a lot of deadlifting. I do a lot of overhead work to try to make sure that my shoulders stay healthy. So I do kettlebell presses or incline bench, things like that. And then a lot of time training my finger strength. So climbers spend a ridiculous amount of time hanging around on little wooden edges, these things called hangboards. Just training our grip, training our ability to hang on to little edges with different finger combinations to get our fingers stronger for the rock.
Those things are nuts. My friends used to rock climb quite a bit, and they would try to drag me along. And first of all, I found out that I wasn't very good at it and wasn't a passion of mine. Well, I don't even like to be on like a step ladder that's more than a few feet high. So the heights thing didn't really work for me. But the hanging boards are crazy. For the listener, imagine like slots in a board that you could put your whole hand, but with like reducing size over time so that there's holes that are even big enough just for one finger. Like you're holding your whole body weight with one finger.
Yeah, with one finger, it's just amazing these days. If anyone is curious about this stuff, you can go on Instagram and search for hangboard training or something along those lines. And you'll find these people all across the world that are hanging by their fingertips on these little like 6 mil edges. They're measured in millimeters because they're so freaking small. And people are hanging their body weight from these things with weight added, or, even doing one hand hangs from like a 10 millimeter edge. It's just ridiculous how strong people get.
Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, that's amazing.
I'm working on it. Yeah. I'm pretty far away from that myself, but, that's what we all aspire to do. Just get better at dangling around.
That's great. So is there like a particular thing you're training for? Is there like a particular climb you have on, something that you're training for?
Yeah, there is. I have a long-term goal. I have a goal. It's a specific route at Smith Rock. I lived down in Bend, Oregon for 7 years. And Smith Rock is an internationally recognized destination climbing area. It's amazing. And there's one route there in particular. It's graded 514C, which is, it's very hard. It's not cutting edge these days because people have gotten so incredibly strong. I think it was one of the hardest routes in the world in the early 90s, for context for people. And climbing's come a long way, but it's always been a uniquely inspiring route to me. And it just kind of hit me in the last year that, I'm 32 years old now. And I had it in my mind that if I was ever good enough to do something like that, it'd be awesome to do that. And something finally clicked about 6 months ago where I realized like, oh, that's not just going to happen on its own. This is something that I'm going to need to train for literally for years to have any chance of doing something that difficult. So that's kind of my guiding light right now. But the nice thing is that there's a lot of milestones in climbing that makes sense to work towards to build up to something like that. So I have a bunch of short-term goals. I have a whole list written out of goals kind of to work towards in the next 6 years, specific routes I want to do or specific difficulty grades that I want to climb. So right now it's a little bit more of a general strengthening approach. Like I'm focusing on getting my fingers stronger and getting better at this kind of basic physically difficult style of climbing that I was describing on those indoor training walls. That's the part that I think is one of my biggest limiting factors for me personally with this goal that I have. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm working towards at the moment.
Interesting. I don't know much about the sport of rock climbing. I think most people would think of like, you go to a certain gym and there's like the thing screwed in the wall, the blocks screwed in the wall that, little kids can climb on. And there's also like, the free solo side of things. Everybody watched that movie. My heart rate was 257 for 2 hours during that show. That was nuts. And I guess I didn't realize how, I don't know if choreographed is the right word, but how truly high technical abilities you have in certain climbs. There's very specific moves that you need to do to be able to climb certain routes. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's perceptive of you. Yes, that's absolutely correct. And just to make you feel better, my palms were sweating like crazy the whole time through free solo as well. So, Alex and what he's doing is in a completely different world than what I'm doing. I mostly sport climb. So I'll give your listeners kind of a general overview of the sport of climbing, of rock climbing specifically, because when I say I'm a climber, a lot of people assume that I climb mountains, and I really don't. I spend most of my time climbing in little caves, little overhanging limestone caves in the desert and things like that. So I'm a rock climber. There's kind of three main facets. If I had to speak really generally, there's bouldering, which is what it sounds like. You're climbing around on little boulders. And that sport is really about finding the most difficult way up a boulder and really practicing highly technical, very physically difficult rock climbing. And that kind of started as training for other modes of climbing, but that has become this whole sport of its own.
No harness, just a few moves. I see people with like a mattress. So if you fall, you're only falling a few feet. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. So those are called crash pads. There's, countless companies that make those and sell those, but they're these foam pads that have backpack straps that you carry out there to the boulders. And, you might have a bunch of them, or you collaborate with your friends and try to build this gym floor basically beneath the climb that you want to do. And then boulders range from, 8 feet tall to 30 feet tall. Sometimes with anything, there's people that are pushing the very edges of these very niche facets of any sport, right? So you get these people bouldering these really tall boulders that are kind of flirting with truly dangerous no fall zone situations. So it's kind of this whole spectrum, but yeah, you got the gist of it.
Gotcha. Okay, awesome. So that's bouldering.
Right. So then the second one, and this is the one that I love the most and is my primary focus, is sport climbing. And sport climbing is where you're climbing a taller cliff, but you're not necessarily following a crack system. So someone has to have gone to this cliff before and developed the routes and cleaned the rock and drilled bolts and put bolts into the wall. And then you're climbing a specific set of moves, a specific route, and clipping your way up these quick draws that are attached to bolts in the wall as you go to the top. And the goal, the sport of climbing, there's kind of these unspoken rules to it, if you will. And the game that I'm playing, the game that we're all playing as sport climbers, is to eventually try to climb from the bottom of the route to the top without falling, without weighting the rope at all. So you're using a rope and you're using safety protection in case you fall. And it's actually a very safe sport, counter to what people assume. But it's much more about, as you said, it's building this choreography around the holds that the rock presents for you. And that part of it's really cool. So there's this problem solving element of, okay, there's these 3 different holds in this 8-foot section. How do I navigate them and move my body around them to scale this part of the wall just using my fingertips and my climbing shoes? So yeah, sport climbing is, a lot of times it's at least vertical or even overhanging rock. So you might be climbing like the underside of a steep cave, if you can visualize that. So that's, like I said, that's what I'm most interested in. And then the third style is trad climbing, and that trad stands for traditional. And this is kind of where climbing came from. And in this case, you're following a crack system, and you're crack climbing, and you're following a crack because that's the way that people used to put protection, and still do. But that used to be the only way to protect yourself, was to wedge little pieces of gear in these cracks. So, trad climbing, if you think of like El Capitan and Yosemite Valley, that's kind of the extension of what a trad climber might aspire to do.
Gotcha. Interesting. Yeah, I'd never heard the distinction between those two things. I can see why this would appeal to you, given your career as an engineer. Was the problem solving thing just right in your wheelhouse?
Yeah, exactly. And I think I don't even know if I realized this, but I've always been drawn to things like that. But when you combine that with this physical component, this physical difficulty, I mean, I've always been a recreational athlete. I've always loved being outside. So combining those things was really powerful for me. And there's this kind of, I have this creative background too. And there's kind of this like creative element to taking this section of rock and turning it into this graceful choreography.
It also seems to me that there would be, I don't know, some kind of connection. This is kind of obvious, but like a connection with nature. But I would take it one step further. Do you feel like you get a connection with the rock itself, with the route itself? Like, do you feel a different level of connection there than most of us would ever be able to feel?
I'm sure I do. I don't really think about that much, but when I stop and reflect on it, I could describe to you the shapes of very specific pieces of rock all over the country. So, like I could tell you about a route that I was trying in Utah and describe very specific holds and the shapes and things like that. So just, by nature of being up there and being so focused, I think that's something that is also uniquely addicting for me with climbing, or that is a big appeal, is that it requires this level of focus that makes everything else in your life and in your busy mind just fall to the wayside, and you have to be completely present to have any chance of doing the route that you want to do. And it requires this level of detail, like not just which holds am I going to grab, but exactly where each finger lands on each specific part of this hold to make it feel, to make your grip the strongest on it. So yeah, you really do. I guess it is kind of intimate. You just become so hyper focused on the details. It's just a really like high resolution connection to the rock. It's pretty cool.
Wow. Yeah, that does sound really special. With baseball players, they always talk about like the pitcher who they just could never hit. And they may also talk about like the pitcher where they just had that dude's number and could always hit off of this guy. Is there a particular climb that you were able to bag that you absolutely loved that was very difficult for you? And maybe one that you really want to climb besides the one that you have coming up that you were never able to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think to answer that, I'll just speak generally to like the styles of climbing that I've spent a lot of time at. I mean, that's how I would answer that, is that I've spent 7 years climbing at Smith Rock, and I spent a lot of time out there at the park. So I've become very tuned into that type of rock, how those holds feel, and what is required to climb on that style of rock. So you just kind of get tuned in to the style at any given area. So my two hardest climbs are at Smith Rock, and they're both 513D, if that means anything to your listeners. And those are still the most difficult things I've done. And these days, as I'm able to travel more, I'm branching out into styles that I haven't spent as much time doing. And this spring, I was down in Utah and I was climbing in these big, steep limestone caves. And the limestone is really different than the rock at Smith, which is a volcanic tuff. And it's slippery and it's intimidating. And the holds are pretty big, but they don't have a lot of texture on them. And it's much steeper terrain. It's very overhanging, and you have a lot more weight on your arms.
Wow.
You can't get as much help out of your feet, and it feels totally foreign and totally intimidating. So I'd really like to work on getting better at that whole style over the next few years. Yeah.
Wow. Trying to branch out and openly take on different challenges and new terrain and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. I've always wanted to be a really well-rounded climber. I want to be able to go to a new area and I guess just enjoy the most inspiring routes there. And so, part of that is becoming physically stronger, but probably a bigger part of it is just building this kind of vocabulary of climbing movement and climbing techniques and things. So always just trying to build on that. Yeah.
Wow. I love that. I just have to interject here before we go any further, since you mentioned it twice. There is no rock climbing in Utah. We don't have anything beautiful or inspiring here. I'm really trying to get monetized by the state of Colorado for sending people that way. So please go visit Colorado. Nothing to see here in Utah. There's no rock climbing. There's no bouldering 30 minutes away from my house. Like, there's nothing. Don't worry about it.
Did I say Utah? I meant Colorado. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So it sounds like Smith is your favorite place to climb. What other places around the country are like that?
Smith is pretty unique. That's what's so cool about climbing is sometimes you have amazing rock climbing in the mountains, and sometimes it's in these river gorges that have, you have these steep overhanging sandstone cliffs that have been carved out by these rivers over millennia or however long. So it can look like a lot of different things in a lot of different places. One of my recent favorite places has been Rifle, Colorado, Rifle Mountain Park near, it's kind of near Grand Junction, I guess, on I-70. So that's a beautiful canyon with limestone lining both sides of the canyon with amazing rock climbing there. It's funny. I grew up in Wenatchee, Washington, where I am now. And ironically, there's amazing bouldering 30 minutes from us in Leavenworth, Washington.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't know about that until I turned 18 and moved away. But this has become one of my favorite places. It's really beautiful out there, and I have a lot of really good memories there. But it's fascinating. There is amazing rock climbing all over the country in places that you would never guess.
Wow. Oh, that's so cool. So I'm glad you mentioned, kind of growing up, and I wanted to actually ask you, how did you first get into climbing, and how did that integrate with, things like school and your profession and all that stuff initially?
Climbing got its hooks in me, and it slowly and steadily started to take over everything else. Just derailed the rest of my entire life. I got introduced to it when I was 18 years old by a friend of mine. We were going out. I think he took me out to Leavenworth after I graduated from high school, just one random day in the summer. I don't remember why. I don't remember him inviting me. I don't remember saying yes or why I said yes, but I remember that first day. And I'd never done anything like it. I thought it was really interesting. I don't know exactly what it was that captured my curiosity about it, but that was the first moment. And then I went to Western Washington University for college, and they had a small indoor climbing gym. And I climbed there my freshman year. I met some friends in the dorms that were into it and started to kind of feed off of their excitement for it. But it was really my second year, I had a friend connect me to the manager of the climbing wall, and I got a job there. And that was when things really started to change. I started spending a lot of my time at the climbing gym, either working or just hanging out. It was kind of my home, where all my friends were, and I started setting routes there. And that's when it really shifted from a hobby to a passion.
Hmm. Wow. So what did you end up studying in college?
I did a double major. I did a Bachelor of Arts in Music and then a Bachelor of Science in Plastics Engineering,
Hmm.
of all
And
things.
yeah, that's super interesting. And you chose the engineering route for your professional career later on, is that right?
I did. Yeah. I don't think I ever planned to become um, a performing musician necessarily. I had the daydream of becoming a traveling rock and roll star and, front manning a band and things like that for a while. But I just studied music because I thought it was really interesting. Music's kind of always been there in my life, and I took some theory classes when I got to college, and I really enjoyed it. And the only way to take the even more interesting theory classes and to study composition and some of these other things I wanted to do was to declare a major. So I don't know if I ever intended to try to make a profession out of that. And then the engineering thing, it just was kind of the subject matter at the college that I ended up stumbling into that resonated the most with the way my brain works and my personality. Um, I have a number of engineers in the family, and it just kind of was the obvious thing that was in front of me. I was always the kid that was building things out of Legos and um, just making things and building things and tinkering in my spare time. So I think it was a pretty natural fit.
Hmm. And we all kind of know the story of what happens. Like, you go to college, you've got your hobbies, and then you have your business, your career, and all of a sudden, like, there's not a lot of time for other things, and your energy is going towards, being a grown up and paying your damn bills like everybody else, and it's hard to maintain, the things that we love and that we really enjoy. So, what was it like as you were evolving in your career to keep climbing in your life, or was that something that you were noticing you weren't able to do nearly as much?
It's funny. I always thought of my job as the thing I did on the side, honestly, which is kind of ridiculous when I think back because I'm not, for context for your listeners, um, you're interviewing me today because I've been able to make a successful podcast, not because I'm one of the best climbers in the world. There are many, many climbers. The people that I interview on my podcast are in a completely different league than myself. So it never made sense for me to think of myself as like a professional climber or even having a chance at that. But for whatever reason, I was still just so obsessed with it and fixated on it that I kind of set my mind like, this is the main thing that I'm pursuing. And then this job that I have at this aerospace company or whatever else it was along the way, this is what I'm doing on the side to make this lifestyle possible.
That's the
So
side hustle. Your main hustle is the side hustle.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But yeah, I mean, I kind of got into that path because I had it in my mind that, if I could live somewhere that had really good local rock climbing where I could climb on the weekends and after work days in the evenings, and if I could have a job that gave me structure, then I could kind of build this robotic, very systematic, this is my engineering brain. I could build this life where I'd be training in the gym, following this schedule, and just kind of strip everything else away and become this amazing rock climber. And it didn't work that well. To your point, work does take a lot of energy. It takes a lot of time. And that strategy, it worked okay. It was fun. And, I'm grateful for the jobs that I had along the way there with engineering. But I did finally come to a place where I realized like, okay, what am I doing here? Like I know that I love climbing kind of more than anything else that I'm doing. And I don't really get to do it that much. I'm sacrificing a lot for the sake of this thing that I don't actually get to do all that much. So that was kind of the thought process that led me to make a pretty massive change.
Yeah. So when was that change, and what was it like to kind of go through, the process of considering like, I don't have to have the same day job that other people have, or what kind of logistical things were you considering at the time?
Yeah, it took a lot of time. I mean, it was a really long, drawn out process just to get to a point where I really believed that I could have a life that looked different than what I had been told it should look like, if that makes sense. I really drank the Kool-Aid for a long time and thought maybe I was just hopeful that some dream opportunity would fall into my lap, but I was never pursuing anything different because I didn't feel that hopeful that there was really a better career path out there for me. I didn't know where to look for it. I didn't know what that might look like. So I considered going back to school to get a master's to teach at a community college because, then at least I would have summers off. But yeah, it took me a lot of time to really get to a point where I was willing to start challenging those assumptions. Like, why is it that I think I have to have this normal job? And why is it that I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur. I just didn't think I was built for that. And I don't know why. I don't know where that belief came from and why I was limiting myself in that way. And it took a long time for that to kind of click. Like, oh my God, there are all these amazing opportunities if I start looking outside of this framework that was kind of handed down to me from, our school system and from the way I was raised and from the culture and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I think it's so ingrained in the culture that we don't spend hardly any time. We'd rather spend hours and hours at a job that we hate versus sitting down for a few hours and being really deliberate with our lives and thinking about what we really want. I mentioned this recently. There was a Joe Rogan podcast, probably 2018, 2017, sometime. I can't remember who he was talking to. And I remember them making this point that there's no limits. You can do whatever you want. Like, you live in a time where there's social media and there's startup companies, and there's nothing saying that you have to do something a certain way. You can go and create the life you want. You've never had this much freedom in your life. And at the time I was working for a big corporation. I didn't take it to heart. And so I continued working at a big corporation for many years until we had to start our own business during the pandemic. And I just look back and think I wish I would have trusted my heart sooner and discovered what that looks like, because life can be vastly different than what a lot of people think it has to be.
Yeah, that's awesome. And similar to you, I think it really was a podcast that I listened to that led me down this path, honestly, because I was living in Bend. I was an engineer. I was working in a cubicle 40 hours a week. And I was really leaning on podcasts just to keep me sane, honestly, just as much. I've always been really deeply obsessed with self-improvement beyond just climbing. I think it started with wanting to become a better climber. But if you want to become the best anything, you start to, the deeper you go into that, the more you realize oh, this is also connected to my physical health and my nutrition. And it's also connected to my sleep. And it's also connected to my psychological and my emotional well-being. And you really start to realize all of, we are complex organisms, and we have all these different needs and all these parts of ourselves that are all connected. And, as much as I was interested in podcasts because of that self-improvement, wanting to scratch that itch, I was really getting a lot of my connection to other people through that medium, listening to these amazing conversations between people. And a lot of these podcasts I was listening to and these guests really became mentors, people I've never met, but they really have influenced me. And Tim Ferriss was, was and is a massive inspiration for me and influence on me. And some of his guests, I've gone on to listen to their podcasts and read their books, and they've had tremendous influence. Seth Godin is a mentor that I've really learned a lot from. But I think it was Tim Ferriss's podcast, and then eventually reading his book, The 4-Hour Workweek. I think that was the book that really got me to start challenging these career assumptions, these self-limiting, career-based. My identity as an engineer, things like that. My identity as someone who could not be an entrepreneur. Reading that book really helped me to start unpacking that stuff and challenging it.
I love that. That book is sitting about 8 inches away from my head as we speak.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's a great book.
Yeah, it is.
So what things did you learn? I mean, we're kind of going through this minimalist thing where we're trying to get rid of stuff and decide what we want in our lives as well. And we're learning the value of time versus, just money, for example, and different objects. What did you learn about yourself as you were kind of preparing to take this on and do this more full time?
I think my transition story kind of goes back to an injury that I had. Like I said, I was living at Smith, and I had about 7 years where I was working a day job and climbing on the weekends. And for a lot of those years, my climbing was going pretty well. I was making steady progress year on year. And the satisfaction I was getting from that improvement was just enough to make the rest of my life kind of worth it, if that makes sense. And I wasn't really that happy. Like looking back on it, I wasn't really that fulfilled by anything else I was doing. But my mission was to become a better climber, and as long as that was working, I was suffering the grind, and it was okay. But I got my first major injury in 2017. I think it was in February that year. And I missed a whole spring season at Smith, which is like the best time of the year to climb at Smith. So I'd been training all winter. I was feeling really strong. And then all of a sudden I was on the sidelines and I couldn't do what I love to do.
What was the injury?
It was a finger injury.
Gotcha.
Which sounds funny, but it's really common for climbers to, we're training our fingers all the time. It's really common to go a little too far and tweak something. And that's a major setback for climbing. There's really, and they take a long time to heal because it's connective tissue. And they just take months and months, and it's pretty debilitating, honestly.
I mean, if you were an NFL, athlete, I would just say throw some tape on it, rub some dirt on it,
right?
You'd be fine. But climbing a little bit different. So that was the first time that you had to kind of slow down and assess things a little bit differently.
Yeah, exactly. And during that injury, it just hit me really hard that, okay, I don't really love this lifestyle. I don't love this life that I've built for myself. I don't feel fulfilled in my work. I've been kind of sacrificing some of my social needs and my emotional needs and community. I don't really have a lot of close friends because I've been living this like hermit climber life. I had some really amazing climbing partnerships in this great community at Smith Rock, but Monday through Friday, I was, my life was kind of sad and it was kind of empty. And that coming out of that injury, it really lit a fire under me to start exploring, like what else is out there, because climbing, it really hit me that climbing was fragile, I guess, that it might not always be there. And that one tweaked finger could take away this one thing in my life that was giving me meaning and purpose. And I didn't like that. Like, I didn't like that I was relying so much on one thing that might not always be there. So yeah, that's really what got me on this path of seeking new ideas. And as far as what I've learned, I mean, I think the biggest lesson I've learned is that, like I said, I was kind of sitting around hoping or waiting for this amazing opportunity or this, light bulb moment to hit me. And I don't think it works like that. Maybe some people have those experiences, but I think what happens more often is, you make this decision or you have this realization that the life that you currently have is not awesome. And you decide that it's more painful to stay where you are than it is to try to make a change. And you just start exploring and you start trying new things. And I tried a lot of things. I tried a lot of business ideas and I tried a lot of creative ideas that didn't really go anywhere. But all of those led their way to the podcast and to what I'm doing now and to the thing that's been really fulfilling for me. So,
wow.
I just encourage people to start moving in any direction, like any direction that seems remotely interesting. I think it's a lot easier to course correct towards the thing that's ultimately going to fulfill you than it works better that way versus just, sitting where you are waiting for that clear compass direction to know what path to start walking on.
Man, that is wonderful advice. I couldn't have said it better myself. That's an amazing piece of advice right there. I love that. Couldn't agree more. So you, as part of what you wanted to do, you literally, this like Chris Farley style van down by the river kind of a thing. Is that how that worked out? Like you went and got a van and I mean, did you kind of learn like how much money you needed to be able to pull this off kind of a thing?
It's funny. I mean, in some ways I'm such a classical engineer and I have spreadsheets for all my training and I map things out and I crunch numbers and whatever else. But I don't know. I'm kind of weird. Like in some things, I just kind of wing it and go for it and it really feels too cumbersome, or like if I think that hard about it, I'll never actually do it, So I never made a budget. I never really crunched the numbers on my expenditure or how much I was gonna need. It just, as far as saving up, I just had a conversation with a friend of mine who had spent a year on the road living in a van. And I just asked her how much money she had when she hit the road. And she told me that she had saved up $20,000 and had that in her bank. And that was plenty. And I was like, okay, I'm shooting for that. That's my goal. But then the van, I put a lot of thought into the van, which one I wanted to buy, how I was going to build it out. So, a lot of my peers, I'm 32, so a lot of my peers have bought houses, and they're real adults. They've invested in themselves in that way, and so I really wanted to invest in something that I was going to be really happy with and that was going to serve me well. So it's a pretty nice setup in the van. I'm pretty comfortable in that thing. I bought a 2014 Dodge ProMaster. And I hired a friend of mine who's a total professional to build it out. And I helped him design it and spec it out. And it fits all of my climbing gear really efficiently. And I'm thrilled with how it turned out.
That's awesome. Just the first one that comes to mind, like when did you get the van and start living this way?
Coming up on 2 years. I bought the van a little over 2 years ago, and then we spent about 6 to 8 weeks building it out. I moved into the van in August of 2019. Is that right? Yeah, I think so. And then I lived in the
That's great timing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then I lived in the van full time, still at my engineering job in Bend for the next 6 months. And then I really struck out on the road in February of 2020. So yeah, funny timing, like that's right before COVID hit.
Timing.
Yeah.
Wow. Thanks for warning the rest of us. Sheesh. So just top of your head, it's been about 2 years. What's been just the first one that comes to mind, an amazing experience that you've had because you chose this route?
Man, I mean, I'm hesitating because there's so much that floods to my mind when I think about that. I mean, this entire project with the podcast, I was just the guy that was obsessed with climbing and wanted to listen to, these amazing climbers talk about what they were doing and talk about their experiences. I was just dying to listen to a podcast that didn't exist. And it hit me one day that I should try to make it. And I had no idea if anyone else would be interested or want to listen to the same things or have the same curiosity that I had about the same topics. But just the fact that has worked and that people have been excited about it, and that, that excitement has opened up opportunities to talk to a lot of my heroes, honestly. I mean, that is such a gift, and it's really grown into this amazing community. Like, that is part of it that I didn't anticipate, is that I feel like I have all these friends, that know me really well because they've really heard me share who I am, through all these hours of interviewing people. And, I just started a Facebook group that I have with, listeners to the podcast, where we can actually have more discussion and I can get to know them. And it's just amazing what's grown out of it. So yeah, I mean, really, there's all these amazing places I've been able to travel and amazing routes I've been able to climb and things like that. But really what comes to mind at the top is having these opportunities to have these amazing conversations and share that with so many great people.
That's awesome. I'm so glad you decided to go there. I really wanted to deep dive into your podcast. I have to tell you, your podcast is super enjoyable, and I'm not a climber. Like, it's so cool to hear these stories. You have great guests. You ask really good questions. You're able to unlock some really cool things. And I would submit that you do not need to be a climber to really enjoy the podcast. Podcasting is so special. There's something about it, and I'm so glad that you discovered that as well. Tell me a little bit about the idea. Like, when did that first become your mission, is to make a podcast that didn't exist, like you said?
Yeah, I remember the moment. And like I said, it really grew out of me being just a massive fan of podcasts myself. I listen to podcasts constantly. And increasingly so as the years went on in my cubicle, I just started listening to more and more. And I'm trying to think of the timing. This was about a year. It must have been like February of 2018. It was about a year before I ended up launching the podcast myself. But I was flying down to San Diego, and I was actually going on an audit trip. I was going to do an audit training for my job. I worked as an auditor for this aerospace company for a while, which has served me really well in podcasting. Oddly, I never anticipated that, but I was going down for this training, and I was on the flight, and I was reading Tools of Titans, a book by Tim Ferriss, on my Kindle. And it's this book that basically, he basically distilled all of the insights from, 200 of his episodes with these amazing guests into this playbook for life. And I remember reading that and just thinking, this needs to exist for climbing. That would be so cool. And I don't know why, but it just kind of hit me in that same moment that for whatever reason, I thought I could be the person that put all that together. And, Tim did the podcast and then wrote a book after, and it kind of hit me in reverse. Like, I want to make a book like this for climbing. And I think the best way to research for the book is to do a podcast. So that's what sparked it. And I may never actually write the book. I don't know. I love doing the podcast so much. And like you said, there is just this amazing quality with this medium that is so special. And I don't totally understand why. Like, I listen to Joe Rogan as well. I don't know why it's interesting to watch a 3-hour interview between two people that I don't know talking about something that I'm not all that interested in. And somehow it's still fascinating. I don't know what that is, but there's just some very human kind of primal need, this unique kind of opportunity to be a fly on the wall and just be a part of this really intentional conversation. It's just really special. So I've fallen in love with it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I used to tell people that if you write a book, like the second you're done writing your book, you may evolve your thinking, you may change your mind about something, but the book is done. It's already kind of been captured unless you do another edition. With, a medium like a podcast, you're getting that person's thoughts about something right then. And I think you made such a great point, the human connection that's really primal. You do such a great job of this in your podcast. You listen. You don't talk all the time and talk over your guests. You do a really good job listening. And I'm just curious to know, has that helped you with your communication skills outside of podcasting as well?
I would, I'm laughing because, I would like to think so, but probably not. And that is something that I'm actually working on right now. It's really funny because I get that compliment quite often. And I do think I'm a good listener. And I really enjoy having conversations with people. And I like to pick people's brain even outside of the podcast. Like, I think that curiosity came first, and that's served me well with the podcast. But I was laughing at myself because, like I said, I'm here in Wenatchee and I'm spending time with my parents. And I'm like, man, why is it hard for me to be the same inquisitive, thoughtful, supportive listener for my parents that I can be with these strangers that I'm meeting? It's the whole thing, like spending time with your family. It's
totally different.
And I love my parents, but yeah, it's hard to be consistent like that all the time, but it's really cool in a way to kind of have built something that gives me accountability. Like, I want to be the person that is curious about everybody, that asks them thoughtful questions when I meet them at the crag. And it's really cool accountability to have this thing out there in the world and to meet people at a new climbing area and think like, I don't know if they've listened to the podcast or not, but I want to be the person that they know me to be. I want to be the person that is, curious about them and really hold space for them. I really believe that everybody is interesting if we ask them the right questions, and everybody has something to teach us. And I don't always live up to that, but I try. I'm working on it.
Yeah, I know. I couldn't agree more. I think that's super well said, that everybody has a great story. It's just whether you can capture it or not. I know it's a big priority for you, and it's also a huge priority for us to try to go just a little bit deeper and find something that's a little bit unique, because you start to realize with some of these people, like, this may be their 5th interview they've done today. Like, they do these a lot. And so to be able to try to capture something that's a little bit different and unique is a big priority. And it sounds like that's a big priority to you as well.
It is. It is. And I've just always, I don't know why, but I've always just been fascinated by people. I've always been interested in deeper conversations, and I've always connected with people a lot more closely when they're willing to talk about the real stuff of life, their struggles and things they're thinking about, and these deeper existential questions. That's always kind of filled me up, and I've always thrived on that. And I have a harder time with, small talk, chit chat, that sort of thing. So, it's the podcast. I mean, as much as it's about performance climbing, it's just such an incredible opportunity and gift to be able to sit down with a human being and learn that they're not that different from yourself. Like, they might be a hero. I talk to a lot of people who are people I've had posters of on my wall, but you sit down and bring this intention to this conversation, and you realize, like, oh man, we're all struggling with the same things. And just sharing that message alone is such an incredible gift, I think, because it's so often that we all feel alone. Like, we feel like we're out there, we're all just winging it,
That's a great way to say it. That's what we're doing. No, that's beautiful. It's the humanity of it. I really love that. I mean, before we got started, I just didn't feel like I had a voice. I didn't feel like I could host somebody who's been hosted on other shows and tell a story that hasn't been told. And that was really difficult resistance that I had to overcome before we got started and before we hit record for the very first time. And I'm just wondering, was there any resistance that you had to overcome to be able to do what you do?
Yeah. That's awesome to hear you say that. And thanks for sharing that. And I can 100% relate to that. Yeah. I mean, because like I said earlier in the conversation, I will never get attention on social media or from sponsorship companies or anything along those lines because of my climbing ability. I'm just another guy that climbs pretty well, and I don't know. I tend to sell myself short, but I'm so far from being like a pro climber or a really high profile climber, and that's a big imposter syndrome point for me. Like, I feel like anyone could be asking these questions to these people. So what the hell makes me special? Like, why do I get to do this? And the answer is as simple as I did it. I just decided to start doing it and make this thing that didn't exist before. And, it's taken a long time for me to get comfortable, especially with sharing my own voice. I think that's a big part of why it's easy for me to sit back in the conversations and listen, is that I feel like, who am I to share anything? Who am I to say anything? I mean, these climbers, I'm a nobody climber compared to all these people that I'm interviewing. And I'd way rather hear what they have to say rather than share my own insights or stories. And what's been really strange for me and what's taken time for me to get comfortable with is I get a lot of emails from people now, and I get a lot of, direct messages and people asking me questions. And I eventually started doing Q&As because people wanted to hear from me. And that felt really, that really triggered that imposter syndrome thing very strongly. And, I think as you go through it, the confidence comes just because of the feedback you get from people. If enough people tell you that they want to hear from you, and if enough people tell you that your feedback or your clarification that you gave them, or whatever, your comment in an episode or your answer to an email really helped make a big significant change for them, eventually that does sink in and you start to internalize that. But yeah, that's been an ongoing challenge for me for sure.
Man, so cool. Okay, this is kind of a funny question. I always laugh whenever I get the question, but it is for a point, and that is, how much money do you make by podcasting? Which, again, my answer is die laughing. What is the point of your podcast as far as what else do you get out of it? Why do you do it?
Right. I certainly did not get into it for the money. But at the same time, I've been incredibly encouraged. I decided to go forward with a Patreon model. So I get direct support from listeners, and I do bonus episodes with people that I've had on the show. So I have them back on, and we just do like a more informal phone call. And we talk about like a really badass route that they just did, or maybe in our first conversation on the podcast, they had a goal that they were working towards, and then they achieve the goal, and then we do like a short follow-up conversation and talk about it. So I do that as bonus content for patrons, and it's like $5 a month gets you access to that. And a lot of people have jumped on board with that, and a lot of people, I reach out and send them emails and I say, oh my gosh, thank you so much for your support. And they're, more often than not, I get this email back that just says, no, thank you, like I really love the podcast and I really appreciate what you're doing. So that's been incredibly encouraging to me. And I didn't know if this thing would work at all. And, I'm less than 18 months into it. And the Patreon is at a point where, as long as I'm living in a van and living very simply, it's breaking even with my expenses, and It's supporting this lifestyle on the road. So yeah, I'm really excited. And what I'm working on for myself right now is to really look at this, my self-limiting beliefs about money, and to think of myself as a professional and think of this as a business and see what it can grow into. Because I have a lot of ideas that I'm excited about. I would love to hire people to help me with certain parts of the business and the podcast and free up some bandwidth. But I've worked in the climbing industry, and there's just kind of this, there's this taboo around money in the industry, and no one thinks that there's any money in the climbing industry. And, our lineage is, dirt bags living in Camp 4 in Yosemite, living off of peanut butter and cat food, or, whatever else, like just doing whatever it took to climb. So, but it's changed a lot. Climbing is going to be in the Olympics in a month from now, and it's really growing into a completely different sport. So I'm pretty encouraged. Yeah, I'm gonna really try to grow this into a career if I can.
That's amazing. I think it's really shocking for most people, like seeing those, downloaded software programs running in the background that you're not even aware of, like the self-limiting beliefs of money. That's a very real thing and a difficult thing to address. Would you say you're on the other side of that, or is that something you're constantly like trying to work on?
No, I'm totally in the thick of it. I'm totally working through it right now. Because I've always been someone as well that puts more value in time and experience than money. I don't need to make a lot of money. I've never aspired to make a lot of money. But when I zoom out and I look at what I'm doing, and I look at the value that I'm creating for people, and I look at my list of ideas that I would like to have more bandwidth for, there's a lot of really positive things that would come from growing this business and bringing in more revenue. So, and I think, yeah. So it is still difficult. I'm actually getting some coaching in that department right now, and I'm investing myself in that way. And that's been really helpful because that is a challenging point for me.
Wow. That's And if you're in society and like everybody else, the same metrics are going to apply on answering the question on whether you are successful. And so I'll just ask you, do you feel like you are successful? And if so, like what are your main metrics to tell you that you're on the right track and you are living your best life right now?
That's a cool question. Thanks for that. I do feel successful in that I set out to make this podcast that I was dying to listen to. And this might make me sound like a narcissist, but I love my own podcast. I love listening to it because I get to hear my guests tell me, give me answers to all of my most burning questions. Like those are the things that I'm asking them, are the things that I'm genuinely the most curious about. And it's so much fun. It's so much fun. So, the fact that other people had similar curiosity around, everything I ask about, from training to these amazing, historical or not tall tales, these true tales from these historical figures in climbing. I in some of the human stuff, like I have a lot of pretty deep human conversations on the podcast, and I ask all my guests something that they've been grateful for. I always leave off with that question: what is something that you've been grateful for? And that wasn't really a plan from the start. It just kind of evolved. But the fact that people appreciate that and like that and continue to have really thoughtful answers to that, I mean, all of that is just like icing on the cake. I couldn't be more thrilled about it.
That's great. We've got that written down as one of the last things we were going to ask you, actually. What are you grateful for?
Yeah, I have a lot to be grateful for right now. My health comes to mind. That's kind of at the top of the list. I was dealing with another finger injury over the winter and into the spring, and it wasn't a big deal, but those are always, anytime you get injured like that as an athlete and you're not able to, go 100% and really pursue improvement to the level that you want to, it just puts things in perspective, and it reminds you how special it is that you get to do what you get to do. And so I've been really grateful for health. And, I had a really small health scare recently, had to go to the doctor and get something checked out. I was freaked out and I thought I had melanoma, and everything's fine with that. And I just feel really grateful to have my health, and it's been really nice to spend some time with family here. So
love that. Great answer. Man, okay, I'm going to tweak our final question that we always ask people. And I'm just going to say, looking back on your life and your experiences and things that you've gone through, choosing a different route, doing something that not everybody is doing, and taking, such ownership on a project that may or may not ever be able to pay you back in cash. I want to know, what is one piece of advice you would give somebody from your life that they could use for benefit? An experience, it could be a story, it could be something you've learned along the way. Anything that you would give that you've learned through your own experience.
Get curious. I think that's the shortest answer I can give, is just choose to become a curious person. There is so much to be learned. There's so much opportunity. We live in an age where we have more opportunity to learn than we ever have in history. And I've learned so much more since college than I learned in college. And most of it was through listening to podcasts and listening to audiobooks and reading people's blogs, and, just kind of collecting these mentors that are out there in the world that are giving away a lot of their most valuable life lessons for free. And you get to, you have this opportunity. If you have a smartphone, you can sit down with them and learn from them. And those insights can change your life. And when you start getting curious about those assumptions and those beliefs that you're holding on to, and where they came from, and getting curious about whether or not you even like the life that you have right now, and what is scaring you? What is scaring you about taking that leap that you want to take? Because very often it feels risky, but there isn't any real risk. Like, how hard would it be to really get back to exactly where you are now if you took a chance on something and it didn't work out? And I'd be willing to bet that it wouldn't be that difficult. There's not a lot of real risk there. So
sure.
Yeah, get curious and start exploring.
Man, I absolutely love that. I mean, if you've gotten to that place in your life once, you can do it again, clearly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Man, this has been a blast of a conversation. I have loved learning from you and your podcast. Even though I'm not a climber, I would highly encourage the listener, go over and listen to the podcast. He does a great job. Make sure you drop them a rating and review. Even if you're not a climber, you will learn all kinds of great tips and tidbits of information that you can use and apply in your life. I think it's so valuable, and it's definitely a show that's going to stay in my normal rotation. Steven Dimmitt, where would you like people to go one more time to connect with you and to connect with your show and reach out if they need anything?
Yeah, thanks, Casey. I really appreciate it. You can find me. So the podcast is called the Nugget Climbing Podcast. You can find it anywhere podcasts are found. Just type in the Nugget and it should pop up right there at the top. Thenuggetclimbing.com is the website. I always do very thorough show notes for all the episodes, and you can listen to episodes there as well. And I recently made a page called Top Lists, where you can browse by category and explore some of the best episodes of the podcast. So if you're new to it and you just want to dip your toe in and check things out, that's a good place to start. And then I'm probably most active on Instagram. I have a personal one that I don't put a lot of energy into, but the Nugget Climbing, at the Nugget Climbing on Instagram, I'm putting some energy into that. So you can find me there. And then, like I said, there's a Facebook group, and that's called the Nugget Climbing Community. And that's new, and I'm really excited about it. There's a lot of like-minded people in that space, and it's brand new, but it really seems like people are showing up to that interested in, thoughtful, intentional discussion and conversation and connecting with people. So it's a pretty cool thing.
Man, that's awesome. We will link to all of that in our show notes. Steven Dimmitt, thank you again so much for everything that you do. Thank you for the care and intention that you put into your podcast. And thank you for taking the time to come on our show today and teach us about your life and lifestyle and about chasing dreams. I just think it's a really cool and empowering story. And we're just so grateful for you and your life and taking the time to talk with us today.
Well, I could say all the same to you, Casey, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.